Okay, this shir is about the question of how to say K'riat Shema in shul when you are with a minyan, uh, according to Chazal, or at least according to the custom assumed by Chazal. So there is very little in Talmudic sources about how you're supposed to say K'riat Shema, and indeed many other things, but particularly K'riat Shema with a minyan, together in a communal fashion. There's a lot more about how you're supposed to say K'riat Shema as an individual and various criteria that need to be met in order to be Yotze. But what we do have as regards K'riat Shema is basically this. So in the Masechet Megillah, it talks about a concept of Pores es Shema or Pores al Shema, depending on which Girsa you think is correct, which we don't need to discuss now. And it tells us there that you can't be Pores es or al Shema without 10 men. So that's the way of doing it in a communal fashion. And it also tells you that certain people are ineligible to do it. So a child can't do it. However, someone with ripped up clothes can do it, and a blind person is a machlukas. But what it doesn't tell us is what Poris Shema is. It just seems to assume that. We have another reference in Masechet Ta'anis, where it's talking in the last perek, where it's talking about the Ma'amadoth. And it's what the Ma'amadoth do is that they read from Maaseh Bereshith, from the first perek of Bereshith, and it says that they do it at Shacharit, they do it at Musaf, and at Mincha, Koren al Peh, Koren es Shema. They read it, but not from a scroll, as they do in the Shacharit and Musaf. They read it by heart. Fine. As you do K'riat Shema. Well, how do you do K'riat Shema? Again, it seems to be something that is assumed that the reader is expected to know, but it's clearly something that we don't know, as we shall see. But there is one more Mishnah that almost gets us there, and which will be the start of our discussion today. So that Mishnah is the Mishnah in Masechet Sotah, the fifth perek, either Mishnah 4 or 5, depending on. I've seen both. I'm going to quote from Cathaviad, Cambridge. Why? To make a point that I think, on the whole, as a starting assumption, it's better to use Cambridge than Kaufman. It doesn't really matter in this case, but you have to pick something, so I'll pick that. So it says, Bo bayom darash Rabbi Akiva az Yosher Moshe uvnei Israel es hashira hazoth ladoshem. On that day, so it's already talked about the various droshes that were made on this day, and it's going to talk about more. That doesn't need to concern us here. Rabbi Akiva expounded the pasuk az Yosher Moshe uvnei Israel es hashira hazoth ladoshem. Vayomru she'en tamud loma lemo. The pasuk doesn't have to say lemor. It could just say vayomru. Obviously, if they said it, they said it. It doesn't need to say vayomru lemor. They said it saying, or however you want to translate lemor. Now, I mean, you could obviously ask a similar question on a very large number of pasukim from a pashat level, but the drasha is she'en tamud loma lemor v'lama ne'emar lemor ela shaha Yisrael onin acharav shemoshe al kol dava v'dava. But it comes to teach you that Israel answered after Moshe on every thing, let's say every pasuk. Kokorim es hahalel, like one, not like one, like we, like people read the Hallel. And then it quotes a pasuk, Ashir al Hashem ki v'oga, which is of course the first pasuk of Shirat Hayam. Now, that pasuk is not quoted in every printed edition. I was able to check, and quite possibly every printed edition that exists. I don't know. But it is quoted in every manuscript except K'tav Yad Parma. It's also quoted in every Geniza fragment I was able to find. It's quoted in every manuscript of the Bavli on where it quotes, not quotes, where it has that Mishnah on the daf, and it is also quoted in. It also appears in K'tav Yad Vatican of the Yerushalmi, and in the K'tav Yad Leiden, which is the superior manuscript that we have, basically. It doesn't. Well, it does and it doesn't appear. Like many things, it's the scribe didn't write it, but it's added as a marginal note by a copyist, not a copyist. What do you call it? An editor, a magia, however you say that in English. And the thing about K'tav Yad Leiden is that there's the editor, the proofreader, was very active. He corrects a lot of things, and sometimes where he corrects it, so to speak, it's not really correcting it. It's an alternative reading, which sometimes is more correct and sometimes is less correct, and sometimes it's hard to know. And sometimes, though, he corrects it just like a normal proofreading, like it's something that's missed out. And probably that's actually the case here. In any case, it's almost 100% certain that those words should be part of the Mishnah, and we'll see why that's significant in due course. Therefore, it says lemor. Now, what does it mean? They say it like the Hallel and they do this pasuk. Well, basically, when the way of saying Hallel in a congregation, as Chazal understand it, is the Makri says the pasuk, and then you repeat that pasuk, and the Makri says the next pasuk, and you repeat back the first pasuk. You don't do what's called Roshei Prakim. That's how Tosefta understand the question, and that's correct, basically. However, Rashi and Rambam do say something different, which is that you only answer Roshei Prakim on the first pasuk. So according to Rambam, who and this is what's more famous because this is what many Taimani communities do, and wannabe Taimani communities, they do it half pasuk repetition. So in the second one you say B'Seth Yisrael Mitzrayim, and then everyone say B'Seth Yisrael Mitzrayim, and then the Chazan will say Beth Yaakov Me'am Loez, and everyone will say Hallelujah, and go on, and until you get to Lolanu, and then again you'll say Lolanu Hashem Lolanu, and they'll say Lolanu Hashem Lolanu, and then again they'll go back to repeating Hallelujah. But that's not correct. This year is going to be long enough without going into all the reasons why. But here, what we see is that the claim is that K'riat Shema, that Shira Thayam was done in the way that people do Hallel, which is they repeated the first pasuk of Hallel after every single pasuk, or what is called Dava. Oh, by the way, I should mention this is important actually. In the description to the video below, I've included a link to a Google Doc which has all the sources that I'm going to read, and I think for most people, unless you have exceptional visualization capabilities, I very, very strongly recommend that you open it up and follow in that while I'm reading. Okay, so and then the Mishnah continues. Rabbi Nehemiah Omer, Kokorem es Shema hayu korim, v'lo kokorem es Hallel. They read it not like Rabbi Akiva's opinion, the first opinion. They didn't read it like you read Hallel. They read it like you read Shema. Now again, this is exactly, in terms of direct information, this is exactly the same as the Mishnah in Tanis. It doesn't tell us anything. It just says there was a way that you read Shema. Everyone knows what it is, and that's how they read Shira Thayam. But it doesn't actually tell us anything about what this way is. However, it is the start of our discussion, because this Mishnah is commented upon and expanded upon in both Talmudim and in a Tosefta, in basically one source that appears in distinct versions in those three compendia, and that's basically 100% really of our information, or certainly of our information from Chazalic sources, comes from these extensions. So I'm going to first start reading from K'tav Yad Erfut of the Tosefta, Perek Vav Yud. There are two K'tav Yad of the Tosefta on Seder Nashim. There's another one, London, if memory serves, on other Masechtot, but on Nashim we only have two. And I'll just read what it says to start with. If you're following on the sheet, you have to actually skip. You have to skip down a bit. Go past all the different versions of the Mishnah. I've got in 3 different tables from Mishnah K'tav Yad, Yerushalmi K'tav Yad, and Bavli K'tav Yad, K'tav Yad, and we're there. Okay, so Darash Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva expounded. The Sha'a Sha'alu Yisrael min hayam, when Am Yisrael came up from the sea, Shorof Alehem Ruach HaKodesh, Holy Spirit came upon them. Amru Shira, and they read Shira, K'katan shehu koreh Hallel, like a child who reads the Hallel, B'Beit HaSofer, in the schoolhouse. Now, what does that mean? Wa'onen achra al kol inyan wa inyan. They answer after him on every inyan. So inyan is equivalent to davar. We can basically translate it as posuk. Moshe omer ashir el Hashem, v'Yisrael omrim ashir el Hashem. Moshe omer azi v'zimrathiyah, v'Yisrael omrim azi v'zimrathiyah. Okay, now you will notice that is already contrary to what we've just seen in the Mishnah. Is that Rabbi Akiva said they read it like Hallel, and as I explained, that means as they read Hallel in shul, not as they read Hallel in school, and they read Hallel in shul following the principle of Roshei Parakim. So we already have a direct contradiction between the Tosefta, or apparently a direct contradiction between the Tosefta and the Mishnah. Now, if you have the Girsa of the Mishnah that appears in K'tav Yad Parma and printed editions, which omits the words Ashir el Hashem, then you can, although it's still a bit of a stretch, explain that the Mishnah, that when Rabbi Akiva says, they read it like you read Hallel, what it means to say is how you read Hallel in school. Now it's just very unlikely, because that's not what would be understood by the term, by this phrase, how you read Hallel. But you could at a pinch resolve that contradiction that way. But since almost certainly you should be gores these words, that doesn't help you. But we continue. Rabbi Elazar beno shel Rabbi Yossi Glili. Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Yossi Glili, Omer, K'gadol shehu makre es Hallel b'Beit HaKnesset, like a adult who reads Hallel in shul. Wa'ona achra inyan rishon, and they answer after him the first inyan, i.e. the first pasuk. Moshe omer ashir el Hashem, v'Yisrael omrim ashir el Hashem. Moshe omer azir zimrathiyah, v'Yisrael omrim azir zimrathiyah. Okay, so it would seem that Rabbi Akiva's opinion in the Mishnah Dafka matches not with Rabbi Akiva's opinion in the Tosefta, but with Rabbi Yossi Haglili, the son of Rabbi Yossi, Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Yossi Haglili. Rabbi Yossi Haglili, of course, being Baal Plugta, frequently with Rabbi Akiva, so of the same generation. So Rabbi Elazar Benosha Rabbi Yossi Haglili, who doesn't appear very frequently in any source, would be of the next generation. Davka, his opinion seems to match with the opinion of Rabbi Akiva in the Mishnah. Okay, but we get to the directly interesting thing for our purposes, which is Rabbi Nehemiah Omer, Kivnei Adam Shekorin Es Shema. And so far, this has just been like something safum, like we don't get to understand what that actually means, but now he says it. Shene'emar, as it says, Vayomru Lemor. This is similar to the Joshua of Rabbi Akiva in the Mishnah. Melamed Shahaya Moshe Potheach Techila, that the Moshe would open to start with. Yisrael Omrim Acharon, and Yisrael would answer afterwards, Wagomrin, and finish. Moshe Omer, as Yoshe Moshe would say, note, because we're going to come back to this, unlike in all the previous two versions, not the Moshe starts with Ashir Hashem, Moshe starts with Az Yoshe Moshe. Well, Yisrael Omrim Ashir Hashem. Moshe ma Azi was Imrafia, Yisrael Omrim, Ze'eli, Wa'anwehu. Moshe ma Hashem Ishmo Hama, Yisrael Omrim, Hashem Shemo. Now, if we look at those three examples, what we see is Moshe says something, and then Am Yisrael answers not what he said back, and not something before. They answer the next part. So he starts, Moshe would say, Az Yoshe Moshe. And they would answer back, Ashir Hashem. And Moshe would say, Azimra Zirafia. And they would answer back, Ze'eli wa Anwehu, which is afterwards. And he would say, Hashem Yishmachana. And they would say, Hashem Shemul, which is two halves of the same posuk. Now, based upon this source, Ismar Elbogen, who was a German kind of a Judeo-Wissenschaft, or whatever it's called, scholar of the late 19th and early 20th century, who ended up at JTS in America, like a lot of these kind of great scholars. He took this, he focused on his source and he wrote about it, and he was quoted by Kaufmann Kohler, who was another German rabbi, but he ended up as a Reform rabbi in America somewhere. And I'm using my language precisely here, and we'll see why in due course. He cited Ismar Elbogen as saying what I just said, which is to say, the way they used to say K'riat Shema in schul with a minyan in the times of Chazal was the pores would say the first half of the posuk, and the congregation would say the second half of the posuk. They would answer him. So I'll say it using like a Western Ashkenazi trop, not because I'm endorsing it, just because whatever, it's what sticks in my head. So he would say, Shema Yisrael, and everyone would say back, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. Then there'd be some sort of pause for Baruch Shem Kavod. And then he would say, Hafta Es Adoshem Elokecha, and they would say back, etc. Breaking up each posuk. He says the first half, they say the second half. And this was written by other. This was taken up by other historians of Jewish liturgy, like Yisrael Noll and Reuven Kimmelman, who is a big chief, I understand, at Brandeis University. But this is also quoted. It's quoted by Shaul Lieberman. It's quoted by Rav Buch briefly, or at least it's referred to by Rav Buch briefly in his Perush on the Yerushalmi Shlita. And it's also quoted by Safrai and Safrai on their very important commentary on the Mishnah, which incorporates a lot of academic sources. And so this idea that there was that the Shema is supposed to be done using kind of what's called responsive antiphony. And there's some other, this also explains the language pores eth Shema. So if we gores eth and not al, pores means to split something. So you split each posuk. You split each posuk into two, just like your pores a loaf. You slice the loaf in two. And there's also some support is brought from a certain piyutim that divide up Shema Yisrael and Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad into kind of responsive chants. So I read about this and I thought that sounds cool, and I incorporated it into the davening that we do in Kasrin when we're able to convene a Nusach Eretz Yisrael minyan. And I enjoyed it. I thought it was cool. And that would have been the end of the story, except that two Bochrim who are currently learning at the Gush, very clever people called Yochanan and Zev, they got in touch and they raised a number of issues and suggested an alternative way of understanding the relevant sources. And so we now have to go back and look again. And we're going to look at this source as it appears in the Tosefta and in the Yerushalmi and in the Bavli. And we're going to come to a significantly different interpretation. So first, let's go back and look at the Tosefta as it appears in Ketav Yad Erfurt. And there's a number of problems with this source. First of all, I already raised one, which is there's a contradiction between Rabbi Akiva's opinion, apparently as expressed in the Tosefta, which is you read it. The congregation repeats each posuk in turn, like you read Hallel in school, which Lechora doesn't fit with what Rabbi Akiva says in the Mishnah. Another thing is that maybe a minor point, but it says, but it's got some relevance. We'll see. It says Darash Rabbi Akiva, B'shasha al Yisrael min hayam, Sharath alehem Ruach HaKodesh, Amru Shira. They got Ruach HaKodesh and they said a Shira. But like, whatever you need Ruach HaKodesh for, you don't need Ruach HaKodesh to, you would have thought, to repeat after Moshe Rabbeinu everything he says. Just listen and say it. I mean, obviously it requires a certain amount of concentration and skill and whatever, but it doesn't require Ruach HaKodesh. Like, if you were to doing what we say, if we were to say that he said the first half of the posuk and they said the second half of the posuk, that might require Ruach HaKodesh, because otherwise how would they know it, right? Or if you say they all sang it together, then that would require Ruach HaKodesh, because otherwise how would they know it? But this stuff seems to be the way that least, of all the possible ways you could do Shirat Yam, this least requires Ruach HaKodesh. So that's number 2 problem. Problem number 3 is that in Rabbi Nehemiah's opinion, we have the issue that he starts off by saying, Moshe says, Az Yoshir Moshe, and they said, Ashir el Hashem. They respond back, Ashir el Hashem. And that's weird, because obviously, Az Yoshir Moshe didn't say Az Yoshir Moshe. Now, I'll admit that when I learn these sources, I notice that it's not like, it's quite obtrusive. But I just kind of thought, basically, look, every Eidah, as far as I know, that sings Az Yoshir Moshe, they start singing at Az Yoshir Moshe. They don't start singing Ashir el Hashem. It's set out that way in the Torah, according to the Masoretic tradition, as if it's part of the song. And just like we often treat introductory phrases to Pirkei Tehillim, like Maskil David or Mizmor Asaf or whatever, as if they were part of the song, when obviously they're not really part of the song. Maybe that's just what the source is doing, and it might not be super tip top from a kind of strict historical perspective, but whatever. But even if you do want to say that, you've got a more direct problem, which is in the first 2 renditions, the opinion of Rabbi Akiva and the opinion of Rabbi Elazar ben Osher, Rabbi Yossi Aglili, it didn't do that. It says that Moshe starts by saying Ashira, and they said something back to him, but it definitely doesn't say he said Az Yoshir. So there's something odd about the fact that this source here has Moshe saying Az Yoshir. It doesn't just contradict like what we might call historical sense. It contradicts the other parts of the same source. There's also another issue, which is that it doesn't really match up with the Pesukim as we know it. So he says Az Yoshir, and they say Ashir el Hashem, and then he says Aziva Zimrathia, and they say Ze Eli Wangwehu, but that's not the Hemshech of the Pasuk. That's the next Pasuk. Whereas the next bit goes Hashem Ish Milchama, and they say back to him Hashem Shemo, which is 2 halves of the same pasuk. That maybe you could just deal with by saying they're different concepts of how to break up the pesukim, which is, I mean, almost certainly true given what we know about different reading traditions. I don't mean it's almost certainly true that in this case they did. I said what I meant is it's almost certainly true that they could have done so to speak. So in order to answer some of these issues, the next step we have to look at the other K'tav Yad of the Tosefta, which is K'tav Yad Vienna. So it starts as follows: Dorash Rabbi Akiva, B'sha'a sha'al Yisrael min hayam, bikshu lo ma'shira. When Am Yisrael came up from the Yam, they wanted to say Shira. Shorath alehem Ruach HaKodesh, and there fell upon them Ruach HaKodesh, or Amru Shira, and they said a Shira. Kate said Amru Shira, and the source continues, how did they say the Shira? Now, the most natural and flowing way to read this is that this is continuing to expound Rabbi Akiva's opinion. And I'm not even saying that according to this Giyasa, that's not what this Giyasa intends you to mean, but what I do want to point out is that unlike the Giyasa K'tav Yad Erfurt, which there's no other way of reading it other than this is Rabbi Akiva's opinion of how they said it, it doesn't strictly necessitate you to read that. You could read this source as saying, Rabbi Akiva says when they came up from the Yam, they wanted to say Shira and the Sharath Aleichem Ruach HaKodesh. Subsequently to that, Kate said Amru Shira. This is like the stun of the Tosefta saying, how did they say the Shira? And it continues. Amru Ashir al Hashem, Moshe Amar Aziva Zimratha, Yisrael Amru Aziva Zimrathia. So it's exactly the same opinion, but you can already, again, it's a bit of a stretch, but there's another way we have now of resolving the stira between the Mishnah and the Tosefta, according to this version, which is that according to this Rabbi Akiva is not actually the one who's saying that in the Tosefta that they read it like you say Hallel. That's the stam Tosefta, and it's not strictly connected to Rabbi Akiva's opinion. And we'll see why that's more significant when we get to the Yerushalmi. Rabbi Elazar ben Osher Rabbi Yossi Aglili on there. K'gadol shemak K'riat Shema b'Beis HaKnesset v'onen achrav inyan rishon. Moshe amar Ashir Lashem Yisrael amru Ashir Lashem. Moshe amar Aziva Zimrathia Yisrael amru Ashir Lashem. Moshe amar Hashem Yishmachama Yisrael amru Ashir Lashem. Oh, now that reminds me of, in fact, the fifth issue with the Ketav Yad Erfurt, which is issue. I just kind of skipped over it, but if we go back and look at it, it said as follows: Rabbi Elazar ben Osher Rabbi Yossi Aglili Oner, K'gadol shemak K'riat Shema b'Beis HaKnesset v'onen achrav inyan rishon. Moshe amar Ashir Lashem Yisrael amru Ashir Lashem. Moshe omer Aziva Zimrathia Yisrael amrim Aziva Zimrathia. So in Ketav Yad Erfurt, it gives two opinions. First, in the name of Rabbi Akiva, as is explicit in that version, they did it like Hallel in schul. Second, like Hallel in schul, and then it spells out for you, and it says exactly the same thing both times. He says the first pasuk, they say the first pasuk. He says the second pasuk, they say the second pasuk. So that for sure is a mistake in Ketav Yad Erfurt. There's no doubt that that's a mistake in Ketav Yad Erfurt. There's also no doubt what Ketav Yad Erfurt should say, which is what it just actually did say in Ketav Yad Vienna, which is that he says the first pasuk, they say the first pasuk. He says the second pasuk, they say the first pasuk. We continue. Oh, and then there's one more. Moshe amar Hashem Yishmachama. He says the third pasuk. Yisrael amru Ashir Lashem, and they say about the first pasuk. But now we get to the bit that's directly relevant for our question. Rabbi Nehemiah omer Shnei Emar. That seems to be a mistake there because it shouldn't say. It doesn't make sense. Bnei Adam shekorin es Shema b'Beis HaKnesset. Like we see, like people read in schul, which means Shnei Emar, as it says, Vayomru lemor. Melamed shehaya Moshe posech b'davar techila, v'Yisrael omrim acharav, v'gomrim inon. So this is already a different lashon. In Ketav Yad Erfurt, it said that Yisrael omrim acharav v'gomrim. They would answer afterwards and finish, i.e., mashma. What we've been talking about this half pasuk and antiphony. But here it says v'gomrim imo. They finish with him. So it sounds now like he actually reads the whole pasuk, but they only read the second half of the pasuk with him, something like that. But then it says differently to Ketav Yad Erfurt. Moshe amar Ashir Lashem, Yisrael amru Ashir Lashem v'gomer. So whereas in Ketav Yad Erfurt it says he says Aziva Zimrathia and they said Ashir Lashem, here it says he says Ashir Lashem, and then it says that they say Ashir Lashem, etc. Then it said then the rest of it's the same as Ketav Yad Erfurt. Moshe amar Aziva Zimrathia, Yisrael amru Zeli Wamehu. Moshe amar Hashem Yishmachama, Yisrael amru Hashem Shemo. However, if you didn't have the last two lines, you could read it, or the last two bits, you could read it as follows. He says Ashir Lashem, i.e. he just says the first couple of words of the pasuk, and then they say after him Ashir Lashem, they say the whole pasuk. And then how you want to read the last bit, if you were to say that is the correct interpretation of this source, you would have to say that the last bit is either some kind of shorthand for that, or the last bit is a shibush. But before we arbitrate which of what's the correct way to do that, to arbitrate that dispute, let's go to the Yerushalmi, and we're going to see a lot of interesting things now that relate to our source. Now, as regards the Giyas in the Yerushalmi, there's a bit of issue. There's some issues here, which is that Ketav Yad Leiden's got a lot of mistakes in it that have to be corrected by the Magia again. But then Ketav Yad Vatican, which is the alternative one, just has a lot of mistakes in it because it always has lots of mistakes. So what I'm going to read is Ketav Yad Leiden as corrected by the Magia. So, although we're going to look at K'riat Shema Vatican as well in a sec. So it starts off. So there's a difference between K'riat Yad Leiden and K'riat Yad Vatican, which is that K'riat Yad Vatican has the Mishnahs and the Gemaras arranged in the same way that you're used to from like a standard Vilna Shas in the Bavli. So Mishnah, then Gemara, the next Mishnah, then some Gemara. Whereas K'riat Shema does it differently. It has all of the Mishnahs arranged at the beginning of each perek, and then it just has the whole Gemara in one big go. And how do you know which Mishnah this Gemara is attached to? Well, you just kind of have to figure out because it's more or less in order. But also what it does sometimes, just like you see sometimes in the Bavli, or not even sometimes, frequently in the Bavli, especially when it wants to refer to like the second part of the Mishnah or something, it will quote the bit of the Mishnah that it's referring to. So it quotes and it says, Bo bayom darash Rabbi Akiva az Yoshim Moshe. And then it says, Stam, no attribution. Lekatan shehu makret hala b'veit hasefer, wehen onin achra akol dafa v'dafa, Moshe ama ashira, wehen onim achra v'ashira, Moshe ama azi, so again, first opinion, but here it's even one step further away from attributing it to Rabbi Akiva, as in K'riat Shema, we saw in Tosefta, this opinion is clearly attributed to Rabbi Akiva. In K'riat Shema, you could read it as attributing to Rabbi Akiva, or you could, although it's slightly more dachuk, read it as just a hemshech. Rabbi Akiva said a kind of general statement about Shirat Yam, and then it gives an anonymous opinion. Here, the fact is, it's just an anonymous opinion. The only way it connects it to the only way it's connected to Rabbi Akiva's opinion in the Mishnah is that the K'riat Shema quotes a little piska of Rabbi Akiva, Bo bayom darash Rabbi Akiva. Now, in K'riat Vatican, which is set out differently, it doesn't even have that. There's nothing in the text at all that tells you that this is Rabbi Akiva's opinion. So it says Lekatan. Okay, so but then the opinion. So now what we can call from the Yerushalmi an anonymous opinion is again what we've seen before, which is that he says the first posuk, they say the first posuk. He says the second posuk, they say the second posuk. Like you say Hallel in school. By the way, you should start like what does it mean by the way how you say Hallel in school? In Chazal's time, at least in Jewish society, they didn't have what we would call a concept of reading. The word likros, that's often translated as to read, doesn't mean to read. It means more like what it means in the Tanakh. It means to call, or in modern Hebrew also, like it can mean to call. And sometimes it appears in Tanakh. You see kore b'sefer, you call in a sefer, but literally means to. It's still the same thing. You're still the essential aspect of kufresh aleph, as a shoresh is saying something out loud. Having it from a sefer is a secondary thing to that, and that's why you can have such a thing as koren al peh. You can't read something by heart. You can say something by heart in English, but you certainly can't read something by heart. That just doesn't mean anything. Whereas in Hebrew, there's no problem with koren al peh because koren doesn't mean reading; it means saying. But more than that, there wasn't a general concept of reading as like reading as a modular skill. So we understand that you go to school after a few years, and assuming everything goes well. Eventually you can read, which is to say it doesn't matter what book you're given, you can read it now because you have the general skills to be able to read any book, which is to say you can look at combinations of words you've never seen before and you can put them together because you know how to put them together. So, it may be that you have to look up some words in a dictionary, and maybe that there's some words that are very like long or complicated, or in English, like irregular spellings or whatever, and you might still need a bit of help. But basically, once you can read anything. But that there's no such thing in Talmudic or Mishnaic era culture. You learn to read, i.e. koreh, not read. You learn to recite a particular passage, and you may or may not learn to recite it with a text. But because you're reading it for sure without any vowel marks, and because for sure you're reading it without any ta'amim marks where to stop, you can't just stare at this piece of paper in front of you with these letters on it and work out how to read it. There's simply no way, at least not fully accurately. You have to find someone who knows how to read it, and he has to tell you how to do it. And B, having learned to read a particular text will probably make it easier for you to learn to read another text. Just like having, if you're experienced Bal Korah and then you have to like learn a parsha that you've never learned before, it's obviously easier for you than it is for just someone who's not a Bal Korah and just has to rock up and do it. But you still have to learn it. You still have to look at the ta'amim. You can't just wing it, because how would you know? How do you know if it's a tavir or a dagar or whatever? There's no way of knowing. And so that's what it means to read Hallel in school. It's just that you got the schoolmaster, and one of the basic, you know, requirements for a Jewish man is to be able to read Hallel. So you've got to do it 18 times a year, 19 times a year, including a Seder night. And he goes to school, and the teacher recites a pasuk, and you recite the pasuk afterwards. You may or may not have a text in front of you to help you. Probably it's easier if you do, but you don't have to. It's not like Megillah where you have to, for example. And so that's what they're doing. We're talking here about an educational exercise. Al Kol Panim, we get to the second thing, which is not an educational exercise, it's a liturgical exercise, which is Omer, Rabbi Elazar, or here it doesn't have the Aleph, Rabbi L'Azza, Benosha Rabbi Yossi Aglili, Omer, Legadol Shu Makre Halal. This is how they would read it. The Vesa Knesset, how you read Hallel and Shul. Heinon Achrab Davar Rishon, the first pasuk. Moshe Amar Shira, Weheinon Rim Ashira, Moshe Amar Ziva Zimrasia, Weheinon Rim Achrab Ashira. And that is how the Baraita, so to speak, the Tannaitic section ends in the Yerushalmi. You have first an anonymous source, not attributed to Rabbi Akiva, which tells you they did it like Hallel in school, posuk. And the second source, which is attributed to Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Yossi Aglili, which says that they did it like the liturgical recitation of Hallel in a shul. Then it stops, it goes to something else, and then it comes back subsequently, and it says Rabbi Abahu, the shem Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina. Now Rabbi Abahu is a third generation Amora, and Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Chanina is a second generation Amora. And it says Kahaden, according to the correction in the K'riat Shema. Kahaden Pasuka, like this Pasuka, like this division. Moshe Amar Ashir El Hashem Ki Golga Susrach. Oh no, sorry. I'm reading the uncorrected version. I need to read the corrected version, which is also as it appears in K'riat Vatican. Moshe Amar Ashira, Vehein Omrim Acharav, Ashir El Hashem Ki Golga Susrach Avayam. Moshe Amar as he was Zimras, which is a slightly odd place to. We understand that Zimras Ka is like one thing connected with a Makaf, but they seem to understand that it's two separate words. So it's Moshe said Azi was Zimras, Wahein Onim Acharav, Azi was Zimrasia, and then it stops. So here we have explicitly, not in the name of a Tana, in the name of a third generation Amora, in the name of a second generation Amora, that Moshe would say the opening part of each pasuk, and they would say the whole. Then they would conclude, and they would say the rest of the pasuk. Now, Mistam, and also clearly from how the Tosefta understands this, as I'll explain briefly, this is explaining Rabbi Nehemiah's opinion. Kahaden pasuk means like this pasuk, like we do in shul, and this is how we do it in shul. The Pores Shema says the first part of every pasuk, and then they answer back with the whole of the pasuk. So, in contradistinction to what I said before, and in terms of responsive antiphony, it would go like this: the Pores would say Shema Yisrael, and everyone would say back, not from where he finished, but they go back and they repeat what he said. They say Shema Yisrael, and then Lechora, they would all then continue Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, and then they get to the next pasuk, and he would say Wa'ohavta, and then everyone would say Wa'ohavta, and then they continue together. Es Adoshem Elohecha v'chol levavcha v'chol nafshecha v'chol ma'odecha, etc. Now we have to deal with the relationship between the Tosefta and the Yerushalmi, which of course we have to deal in general with the reception, the relationship between these two as corpora. So there's an ongoing machlokus among scholars about what the Tosefta is. The prevalent view, it seems to be, but mostly it seems to be because it's held by Shammah Friedman, who deservedly is extremely honored and respected in the field, is that the Tosefta is basically or at least very frequently, older than the Mishnah. Not just older than the Yerushalmi, but older than the Mishnah. And that very often you can understand the Mishnah as being a condensed or modified version of what appears in the Tosefta, which is the more ancient source. Even though I think Shema Friedman and all those who hold him actually agree that the Tosefta is actually completed as a work later than the Mishnah, but the material in it is anterior to the Mishnah, or at least frequently anterior to the Mishnah. And this is often a fruitful way of understanding kind of funny kinks in the language of the Mishnah. However, against that view, I will articulate now a different view, which is that the Tosefta is essentially an abortive version of the Gemara, but on a different principle, which is that you have the Mishnah, and the Mishnah, let's say now the Mishnah is accepted in your Beth Midrash or your Yeshiva as an authoritative source and the basis of study. The question is, what's the next stage from there? Because learning didn't stop, right? So we all know, because we all assume, because we all, at whatever stage we got into this, grew up with it or whatever, that the next stage is you have Tanaim, and then you have Amoraim, and that's how the Gemara works. You have Mishnah, and then you have the whole Amoraic discussion on the Mishnah. But another way to do it, which would be equally logical, at least you might think it, you might imagine it would be equally logical, is to just expand the Mishnah, basically, to produce an expanded version of the Mishnah. As you have more discussions in subsequent generations, expand them. And an expanded Mishnah would include the same types of material that you find in the Talmud, i.e. both post-Mishnaic material, i.e. discussions of Amoraim, what we call Amoraim as opposed to Tanaim. And second, Baraithot that contain material that is prior to the codification of the Mishnah. Of course, all the time in the Gemara, both Gemaras, you'll find Baraithas quoting all sorts of Tanaim who lived sometime or significantly before the Mishnah. So both Gemaras, they're both post-Mishnah, but they also include lots of pre-Mishnah material. And I would say that the Tosefta is in fact exactly the same. It does include pre-Mishnah material, but it also includes very clearly post-Mishnah material. There are a large number of cases which you can show that material that in the Yerushalmi, in particular, although not, could be in the Bavli, but particularly in the Yerushalmi, material that is presented as being quoted by Amoraim in the first and second generations is quoted stam as an anonymous layer in the Tosefta. So what the anonymous layer in the Tosefta is essentially codifying in kind of Tanaitic language, in authoritative legal rabbinic Hebrew, is codifying those first and second generation opinions of Amoraim, and kind of inserting it into a expanded Mishnah text. And I think that is the model that we have to use to understand this Tosefta. So first of all, the Tosefta it incorporates the first opinion, which in the Yerushalmi is expressed as an anonymous opinion, and puts it, at the very least, places it in juxtaposition to the opening statement of Rabbi Akiva, which makes it look like it's Rabbi Akiva's opinion. I think that's probably that the Giyas in K'tav Yad Vienna is more authentic, more old, and K'tav Yad Erfurt is modified to make it kind of smooth it out and make explicit what it kind of seems implicit in K'tav Yad Vienna. So that's one thing it does, as we've seen, that what is presented as an anonymous opinion in the Yerushalmi's presentation of it, comes to look like it's just Rabbi Akiva's opinion in the Tosefta, perhaps because the editor of the Tosefta was working with some kind of text that juxtaposed, as we see the K'tav Yad Leiden does, these words, Bo beyond Darash Rabbi Akiva, and then this anonymous opinion, the Katan Zhu Makriya Halo. So that's one thing it does. But the other thing it does, which is more important for our purposes, is that it incorporates this comment on Rabbi Nehemiah's opinion, explaining Rabbi Nehemiah's opinion, as kind of part of Rabbi Nehemiah's opinion. So what is presented here is the opinion of Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Chanina, who's a second generation Amora, and therefore is completely within the kind of time scale whereby his opinions could be included in the Tosefta. Is here just incorporated into Rabbi Nehemiah's opinion. Now, that's in K'riat Yad Vienna. So we have to look at K'riat Yad Vienna as saying this. Let's go back and read carefully what it says. He would open up at first, and they would say after him and finish with him. I means what? He would say the opening of the pasuk. They would answer after him the opening of the pasuk, and they would finish the rest of the pasuk with him. And then it says, Moshe Amar Ashir El Hashem, Yisrael Omrim Ashir El Hashem. He said literally the first two words without kind of ellipsis, so to speak, and they would say Ashir El Hashem with ellipsis. They would say the whole of the pasuk. Now, the rest of the K'riat Yad Vienna, therefore, is difficult because it says Moshe Amar Aziva Zimrafia, Yisrael Amru Zeliwan Wehu. But as they've suggested, this could be originally been a sort of a shorthand, basically. He said Aziva Zimrafia, and they said Aziva Zimrafia, and then they said Zeliwan Wehu, and that got shortened down to this. But what comes in K'riat Yad Erfut, which, as we've seen, is clearly like a kind of a corrupted and, so to speak, fixed source, but which has really been kind of made into a mess, is that they take the second two examples from Aziva Zimrafia and Hashem Yishmor Chama, and they make that the model for the first one. But then the first part said, he says, Moshe says Ashira, Moshe Rabbeinu said Ashira, and they say Ashira. But then that doesn't fix. If you understand the source as being talking about responsive antiphony, AB, that doesn't fit. So therefore, K'riat Yad Erfut, so to speak, fixes it by saying, oh, well, what if they say back Ashira, he couldn't have said Ashira, he says Az Yashir Moshe. With, of course, the problem, of course, he literally didn't say that. Now, one reason that I didn't arrive at such a conclusion myself, apart from just not being clever enough, is that there's an issue in Schul Lieberman's edition of Tosefta Sota. So with Schul Lieberman famously uses the best text method, so-called, with his edition of Tosefta, which is that he takes one manuscript, which is the best manuscript for that Seder. So he uses different ones for different Sedarim. And then he puts that across the top, and then in the footnotes he tells you all the times when clearly that Girsa is wrong, which is kind of really annoying way to read it. But with Masechet Sota, he does, for most parakim, he does something different. You can see here he has two columns. Why? Because he's got two Kitvei Yad, as we said, for Sota, which is K'riat Yad Erfut and K'riat Yad Vienna, and it's not just on this Tosefta, this particular halacha. Throughout most of it, they're so different, or the differences are so much that actually it's just easier to lay it out this way than it is to have one text at the top and then have all the different versions at the bottom, because actually it'd be more unwieldy than just having them in parallel columns. So he has the right column is K'riat Yad Vienna, and the left column is K'riat Yad Erfut. Now, K'riat Yad Erfut says what I said it when I just read it here. But the fact is, K'riat Yad Vienna, as he has it here, says, Rabbi Nechem Yomer Kivnei Adam Shekorin Shema V'Veitha Knesset Shema Mayor Milemo Melamed Shai Moshe Posek B'Davar Techila V'Yisrael Onim Achrav V'Gomrim Imo Moshe Amar Az Yashir Moshe V'Yisrael Amru Ashir Lashem Moshe Amar Azi V'Zim Rafiach V'Yisrael Amru Ze Ali V'Ham Vehu V'Chole. So the point is that it's just wrong. There's a mistake. I don't know what's going on. He actually says at the bottom that it has this. He quotes K'riat Yad Vienna as having an alternative Girsa. So I really don't know. When I first looked at it, I thought I must have missed something, because if I'm seeing that Schul Lieberman has made an obvious mistake, most likely I've made an obvious mistake, right? But I've gone back. I've spent like a bewildering hour just checking the K'riat Yad against what he writes, and there's just a big problem here. He seems to have, as I said before, he accepts this view of Kaufman and was it Kaufman? Kaufman's the first name as well. Kaufman Koller and other liturgical historians. He accepts this idea of responsive antiphony, and he, so to speak, fixes the Girsa in K'riat Yad Vienna, Davka, the less damaged Girsa, to fix it to make it look like K'riat Yad Erfut, the more damaged Girsa, in order to support this reading of a responsive AB antiphony against Lichora his whole shitta of just using the best text and then putting any issues in the footnotes. So I don't know what's going on there, but it definitely led me down the garden path. Now, with this in mind, we can go to look at the Bavli. Now, the Bavli on the same Mishnah on Sota has a very similar Braita, which clearly is a derivative of what we've seen, but it's much more like the Tosefta than it is like the Yerushalmi, which fits with, I think, an idea that the Tosefta is kind of based upon the Yerushalmi, and then the Bavli's version is based upon the Tosefta's version. That's way over systematic because probably, whatever, I don't want to get into this. I think you understand what I mean probably when I say that it's not literally that the Bavli's version copies literally the version out of Tosefta, because the version out of Tosefta probably doesn't. But the version we see in our Bavli was based upon something that was much closer to the version that we see in our Tosefta, so to speak. Now, the Bavli's version, I'm just going to pick K'tav Yad Venezia, because there don't seem to be really significant differences between them. Tanu Rabbanan. They lifted up their eyes to say Shira. Okay, it doesn't say anything about Ruach HaKodesh here. Wakay said Amru. How did they say Shira? Now, this is in contradiction to the version found in the Tosefta. Davka now, Rabbi Akiva's opinion is now that they said it like adults say, like the liturgical recitation of K'riat Shema. Of Hallel, sorry. As Wahen on an Achrav Rashi Prakim, and they would say after in the heads of each perek, just like in Hallel. Moshe Amar Shir Hashem, Wahen Amar Shir Hashem, Moshe Amar Ki Go Go'a, Wahen Amar Shir Hashem. Okay, he says the first pasuk, they say the first pasuk. He says the second pasuk, they say the first pasuk, etc. Now, this was the opinion that in both the Yerushalmi and the Tosefta was attributed not to Rabbi Akiva, but to Rabbi Yossi Haglili. Rabbi Elazar Benosha Rabbi Yossi Haglili. By the way, in the Bavli, he seems to have changed his name to Rabbi Eliezer Benosha Rabbi Yossi Haglili. Which is a thing that, I mean, it doesn't happen in real life, but it definitely happens in a manuscript. What seems to have happened here is the Bavli has noticed the point which I mentioned, which is it seems almost 100% clear from the Mishnah that Rabbi Akiva is saying they did it like the liturgical recitation, not like the educational recitation in the schoolhouse. So Davka, there seems to be a contradiction in the Tosefta's version, which is Rabbi Akiva contradicts in the Tosefta, or at least a version, the brighter that the Bavli knew, which we find in our Tosefta, contradicts the Mishnah. So it fixes that by switching the opinions. So now what Rabbi Elazar, the notion Rabbi Yossi Haglili said in the Tosefta and in the Yerushalmi, now Rabbi Akiva says it. So how do you continue? Rabbi Eliezer, Banosh Rabbi Yossi Haglili Omer, Katan hamakra esahala wahen omer achra kol mashu omer. Moshe amar Shir Hashem, wahen omer Shir Hashem. Moshe amar ki go go'a, wahen omer ki go go'a. So now the opinion that in the Yerushalmi, as I explained, is anonymous, but in the Tosefta either looks like or explicitly is made out to be the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. Now, because it contradicts the opinion of Rabbi Akiva in the Mishnah, is now flipped to be the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer Benosh Rabbi Yossi Haglili. And then we get to our source. Rabbi Nehemiah Omer, Kasofer Pores al Shema, Beveit Knesset. Stop. So the addition, the explanation appears in the Tosefta, now no longer appears it doesn't appear in the Bavli, and nor does the Amoraic explanation, which according to my argument was incorporated by the Tosefta into the Braita itself, now no longer appears, doesn't appear anything. It just says, we're just back to the Mishnah, which is he read it like they read K'riat Shema. Which is, so it's now gone back to being something nistar. We don't know what it is again. Now, but then we have an anonymous layer in the Bavli which says, "B'maika miflagi." What's the machlokus? We might say, well, kind of obvious what the machlokus is, but it spells it out anyway. Rabbi Akiva Sava lemor amiltha kamaitha. Lemor means you say what the first thing, i.e., according to the opinion of Rabbi Akiva in the Mishnah, which is the opinion of Rabbi Elazar ben Yossi Haglili in the Yerushalmi and the Tosefta. That is back to being the opinion of Rabbi Akiva in the Bavli. They say the first. He says the first pasuk. They say the first pasuk. He says the second pasuk. They say the first pasuk. They keep repeating the first pasuk. Rabbi Elazar ben Moshe Rabbi Yosei Galili Sava Lemor Akol Miltha wa Miltha. He Lemor means that they repeat every posuk. He says the first, they say the first. He says the second, they say the second. He says the third, they say the third. So this is the opinion that appeared as an anonymous opinion in the Yerushalmi. Seems to be attributed, at least in one version of Tosefta, explicitly to Rabbi Akiva, and it's now back. Now it's been switched to being the opinion of Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Eliezer ben Moshe Rabbi Yossi Glili in the Bavli. And then we get back to now our bit, which is the only information we have on what this actually means in the Bavli. Rabbi Nehemiah Sava Wayomru Da'amor Kule Bahade Hadade. They say everything together. Lemor de Pasach Moshe Beresha. So you've got two things. You've got Wayomru teaches us they said it together, but Lemor, so we're back to the redundancy of the language here, because you don't need, strictly speaking, Wayomru Lemor. Wayomru says they said it together, and Lemor says that Moshe opened at the beginning. Now, again, I'll admit my faults. But when I first read this, I thought as follows. The Bavli has the same version of the Brisa as a Tosefta has, but it Davka eliminates the explanation of Rabbi Nehemiah's opinion and then explains it in a different way, which is to say, the Bavli is explaining it as everyone reads the K'riat Shema together, and I basically answered it as follows, which is that the Tosefta is referring to A-B antiphony, and this was a practice in Eretz Yisrael, as explained by the liturgical scholars I referred to before, especially Reuven Kimmelman, but also I think they all kind of mention this really. That this was appropriate for them because apparently Byzantine coronation ceremonies were also done using A-B responsive antiphony, but this would have been irrelevant in Bavel, and therefore they just all kind of said it together, which is what I guess most shuls today kind of in some vague sense attempt to do, or at least Sephardi and Temani ones, but in most cases don't really do. And so the Bavli basically is censoring. When I thought that the version in the Tosefta, as Alpi K'tav Yad Erfurt, was the correct version, I thought that the Bavli was censoring the Breiter and then imposing its own incompatible spin on it. So I was thinking, kind of in the manner of David Weiss-Livni or, the whole Torah darkness school. But actually, as again Zev pointed out, this actually fits perfectly well with the explanation we've seen before. Because what the Bavli actually said two things. It doesn't just say they said it all together. It says they said it all together, but Moshe opened, which fits with again that Moshe Rabbeinu opened with the beginning of each posuk. He said Ashira, and then they said the whole posuk Ashira Hashem Ki Goga, etc. He said Ozi was Zimras or Ozi was Zimras Kar, and they said the rest of the posuk afterwards. Now, I haven't really properly looked into this, but Rambam, as far as I know, he doesn't say anything like this in Mishnah Torah. Perhaps someone will correct me, but he does in his Perush on the Mishnah not quote, but kind of cite this passage. But it's not clear that what he's referring to, whether he's referring to some kind of extant minhag in his own day or not. But if we understand the Bavli as follows, the Bavli in its anonymous Stamaitic comment is actually saying exactly the same thing as the Yerushalmi said. It's saying exactly the same thing as the, shall we say, K'tav Yad Vienna correctly understood, or perhaps at least the source that kind of forms the basis of the Gears that we find in K'tav Yad Vienna, which is, again, the Chazan says, Shema Yisrael, and everyone says back, Shema Yisrael, and then, so Onim Acharav, V'gomrim Emo, and then they all say together, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, again. He says, V'ohavta, he's Poseach, and then everyone says, V'ohavta, Onim Acharav, and then everyone's V'gomrim Emo, Es, Hashem Elokecha, V'chol Avavcha, V'chol Nafshecha, V'chol Ma'odecha. Okay. We have two more sources to look at, but I'm not going to belabor the point. Mechil to the Rabbi Yishmael as follows, because there's obviously extended section there on the Shira Sayam. So, Vayomer Lemor, Rabbi Nechemi Omer, Sharath Ruach HaKodesh al Yisrael, V'hayu Omrim Shira, Kivnei Adam Shehem Koreneth Shema. So now, in the Tosefta of K'tav Yad Erfurt, we saw that, even though it doesn't really make any sense, which is one of the signs that it's a corrupt and Meshubash source. We saw that Rabbi Akiva there says Ruach HaKodesh fell on the Am Yisrael, and they said the Shira in the manner of people learning to say hello in school, i.e. repeating after the teacher every pasuk. But here it says Ruach HaKodesh fell on them, and they Davka said it like Shema. But again, it doesn't explain what a Shema is. Now, but however, it is probably still the case that what's the way of saying K'riat Shema that would require what's the way of saying Shirat Hagan that would require the most Ruach HaKodesh? Obviously, just saying it everyone together, right? Because how would you be able to say it at all if you didn't have Ruach HaKodesh? So probably what the Mechilta Rabbi Yishmael here is referring to as its understanding in Rabbi Nechemiah's opinion, everybody says K'riat Shema just together, like some shuls do or try to do Bizman Hazeh. Then it quotes Rabbi Akiva Omer Ruach HaKodesh Sharaf Yisrael V'hayu Omer Shira Kivnei Adam Shehen Koren Efahalel. They said it like people read the Hallel, which it doesn't explain. But again, as we said, Mistam, unless there's some kind of source that tries to, unless there's something wrong with a source that kind of tries to tell you otherwise, when someone says, or when Rabbi Akiva, but when anyone says they did it like you read Hallel, what they mean is Rosh Parakim. He says the first pasuk, they say it's the first pasuk. He says the second pasuk, they say the first pasuk, etc. But then we get something interesting. Rabbi Eliezer ben Tadai Omer. Rabbi Eliezer ben Tadai says, now, who's Rabbi Eliezer ben Tadai? He appears in like maybe 6 places in the Talmud Bavli. We don't know who he was. But he now gets attributed the opinion of the Amoraim in the Yerushalmi, which, as we've understood, is also the opinion of is how the Stam in the Gemara explains Rabbi Nechemiah's opinion, which is also how the earliest layer of the Tosefta, even if unknownst to the author, is explaining the opinion of Rabbi Nechemiah. He now explains it as follows. Now it appears in the name of Rabbi Eliezer ben Tadai, Abel now completely disconnected from the concept of Shema. It's now only connected, it's Davka, not the Shema, because we've already seen that the Shema is in the first line of the Mechilta to the Rabbi Yishmael. And what we know about that is you need Ruach HaKodesh for it. So, Rabbi Eliezer ben Tadai Omer Moshe haya posech b'dvarim techila. Yisrael onim achra v'gomrim imel. Again, he opens, they answer him, they say about the same thing. V'gomrim imel, and then they finish together. Moshe haya posech b'dvarim omer ashir Hashem. Yisrael onim achra v'gomrim imel. Ashir Hashem ki goga susulach ramam. So this is now very explicit. What I've been trying to argue here is what K'tav Yad Vienna is telling you, and the Yerushalmi is telling you, and the Bavli is telling you, as explanations of how to say Shema is explicit here as Rabbi Eliezer ben Tadai is most explicit here as Rabbi Eliezer ben Tadai's explanation of how they said Shirat Hayan. He says the first bit, they answer back, and then they continue within the whole pasuk. Moshe hai posech omer azi was imrafka. So this time with the Yud Hey, not without it, like K'tav Yad Vienna had it. V'Yisrael onerim achra v'gomrim imo. Aziva Zimrafka, Wahili Lishua. Moshe Hayapotech, Omer Hashem Ishmachama, Yisrael Omrim Achra, Wagomrim Hashem Ishmachama, Hashem Shemo. So this is very clearly telling you, very clearly outlining the pattern that I've been. It's the source that most clearly, clearly and it's the only source that unambiguously, without any room for doubt, outlines this pattern of communal recitation. The only problem is that Davka says this is not how they said. This is not how you do Shema. It's some other way of saying it. Now, Mechilta the Rabbi Yishmael, which is a reconstructed source that we do not have. Different scholars have reconstructed it out of medieval collections like Midrash HaGadol that include all sorts of material from earlier sources, some of which you can trace back to sources we know, and some of which you can't trace back. And therefore, you take the bits you can't trace back, and you use various filters and Savaras and whatever, and you can reconstruct them as the Mechilta of Rabbi Yishmael. Now, this has a source that's very similar to the Mechilta of Rabbi Yishmael here, as in it's got it has the opinion of Rabbi Nechemiah, basically the same as appears in Mechilta of Rabbi Yishmael, and it has the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer ben Tadai again. It's not so explicit that that's what it means here. But it is what it, as in from the Mechilta of Rabbi Yishmael, we can understand that that's what it means. But also, it's the best reading of that source, even independently of Mechilta of Rabbi Yishmael, which is unambiguous. It's the best reading of that source in the same way that is the best reading of what the Amoraim and the Yerushalmi and what K'tav Yad Vienna of the Tosefta and what the Bavli say about the Shema. The only problem then is that both Mechiltas therefore record this as a way of doing communal recitation of something, but Davka not Shema. And that I think is actually an issue, and I don't really have a good answer to that, except to say that in general I believe that both of the Mechiltas are relatively late sources, and in that sense derivative of the earlier sources. And I think it's quite likely that this opinion here is attributed to Rabbi Eliezer ben Taddai deliberately, in a sense, to disconnect it from K'riat Shema, because the authors were familiar with some kind of different minhag, perhaps just most likely the minhag of saying it altogether without any kind of particular aid from the Pores Shema. The problem with that is that it doesn't. You're back to not understand. Back to the mystery of what does it mean to be Pores Shema. Now, if you understand AB, we said before that the liturgical historians of this school, who were followed by Shaul Lieberman and Safrai and Rav Buch Shlita, they understood it as AB antiphony. And Pores Shema means you divide Shema in half, I divide every Shema in half. But when you're Pores a loaf, strictly speaking, you don't have to divide a loaf in half. There's no rule. You can just divide it into like lots of different slices. So I think you can actually just understand Pores Shema means dividing it posuk by posuk, i.e., basically, in order to keep everyone in time and make it dignified and orderly and whatever, the chazan starts every pasuk, and that's Pores Shema, i.e., he divides the Shema into slices, i.e., pasukim. According to Mechilta Rabbi Yishmael, we're back to not understanding what the language of Pores Shema means. Now, that might not necessarily be such a great proof, because some people hold, including Ezra Fleischer, held that actually Pores al Shema is the correct Gisa, and he had a whole big mahalach in what that meant. But I think both Mechiltas are later sources, and the earliest source I think here is the Yerushalmi, which at least tells you what Amoraim understood to mean how you say Shema, which mistam, unless you've got some strong reason to think otherwise, is probably also what the Tanaim would have understood you to mean by saying how we say Shema in schul, which again is the Pores opens each posuk. He says the opening bit, let's say up until the first major pause. Everyone repeats that, continues along with the rest of the posuk under his guidance. Do it posuk by posuk. Once again, that's what the Amoraim say in Yerushalmi. That's what the more correct version of the Tosefta is telling you, though we don't have we have a more and a less messed up version of the Tosefta, but we don't have a kind of pristine version of Tosefta, and it's not necessarily clear that there ever was a purely pristine version of Tosefta, because it might just be that this Tosefta is kind of developed out of it's developed out of the passage in the Yerushalmi already in a kind of mixed up form. And it's also what the Stamina Bavli tells you to do. And therefore, I would say that's certainly at the very least a reasonable way of doing K'riat Shema communally. I think it's at least worth a try. And the twist at the end of the story is that I said before that Kaufman Kohler, in his 1919 article, cited Ismail Elbogen as saying AB antiphony. But actually, as Reuven Kimmelman points out, though he disagrees with this, actually Ismail Elbogen's actual book actually says to do exactly what I've just said, which is opening with the beginning, repeating, and then saying the whole pasuk together. It's not clear actually to me, partly because I can't read German, and so I haven't gone and looked at Ismail Elbogen's original book in German. Why exactly he actually advocated that? It doesn't seem to me that he was mafakpek about the Giyasra and Tosefta or anything like that. The whole argument I've been making here doesn't seem to be that was his argument. He just seems to be that he understood, despite the issue, which is that it's not recorded as a way of saying K'riat Shema, he seems to have understood Rabbi Elazar ben Tadai's opinion in the Mechiltas as being how you understand the earlier sources. But then this has to do with all sorts of different shittahs about how you understand sources, and we don't need to resurrect obsolete Judeo-Wissenschaft paradigms of scholarship. But it is interesting that actually that was the kind of the earliest modern suggestion about how you do antiphony is exactly what I've just suggested you before, and it seems to be that Kaufman Kohler is responsible for kind of getting everything mixed up and confused with this kind of A-B symmetrical antiphony. So that's really all I have to say, except that, of course, in that sense, given that the minyanim that I organized here in Ketzrin, we did do, following the great luminaries that I've already said, we did do A-B antiphony. So I guess in that sense, I owe people an apology for leading down the garden path. What I will say is I think probably everyone will still Yotzei K'riat Shema, because we have a general klal, which is that if you listen to someone, you're Yotzei. Kol v'chomer, if you listen to someone, aren't for your Yotzei, and so I don't see why you shouldn't be Yotzei doing it this way. You could argue about whether the Chazan was Yotzei, because he wasn't answering. But then we hold Shomei Ka'oneh, so if he was listening. But B, also the way we did it, actually, I kind of mixed up the methods, and we actually had the Chazan being Gomer and Imo. So he would say the first half, and he would say the second half along with the Kahan. I addressed this in the article, which I first kind of advocated this. Zev and Yochanan did raise this source in the Yerushalmi, which deals with, it says that someone, in general, if you have mitzvahs, it seems to be talking about mitzvahs where you speak, that you can be motzi someone else, even though you've already fulfilled your obligation. So you've already said Kiddush, you can go and say Kiddush for someone else, he can listen, and he can be Yotzei. You've already said Hallel, but you can go say Hallel for everyone else, he listens and answers in the appropriate places, and he's Yotzei, etc. Birchat Hamazon you can't do. It says, if you ate and then benched yourself, that's it, you can no longer be motzi someone else. And then the source goes on to say, it suggests that maybe also K'riat Shema and maybe also Tefillah should be like that. And the reason why K'riat Shema has to be like that is because you have K'riat Shema is requirement on Shinun, and if you just listen to someone, you didn't do Shinun. Now, that source, it's not clear even within that sugya that that's actually the halacha. It raises that possibility as a possibility. B, I don't think anyone disagrees that that you can be Yotzei, at least some people can be Yotzei from listening to the Shliach Sibur. So when it tells you that Tefillah, you can't be Yotzei from someone else, it appears to be talking about two individuals. It doesn't seem to be talking about a communal setting. C, the fact is, if the requirement is you do Shinun, the fact is, if you do A-B symmetrical antiphony, you did do Shinun. You didn't do all the Shinun, but you did do some Shinun. It's not like so. Like again, I don't think it's something necessarily you, at least maybe I do, but I don't think it's something that you need to like go and repent on Yom Kippur. But with that said, the more correct thing to do is, unless you want to do everyone doing it together, which is probably certainly according to the both Mechiltas is correct, but according to the Talmudim and the correct core of the Tosefta, shall we call it, the most correct thing to do is like what what I've been outlining here, which to repeat is every posuk, the pores says the opening, everyone repeats, and then continues and does the rest of the posuk. That seems to me to be the most correct thing. That's, as I said, is also the opinion of Ismail Elbogen. So we're just returning to the earliest era of modern Jewish liturgy scholarship before it got Meshubash. And that's it. I talked long enough.